When we hear the name Palestine, our minds travel to a land marked by conflict, walls, wars, and news headlines. However, few people stop to ask, where does that name really come from? What significance does Palestine have in biblical and world history? Who first named it that way, and for what purpose? Dear listener, in this documentary, we will explore the history of Palestine from its biblical roots to the present day, listening to the voices of ancient chroniclers, church fathers, rabbis, archaeologists, and modern historians. We will analyze how a simple name became an ideological, theological, and prophetic battleground. Let's get started. Let's travel back in time to the heart of the ancient Near East. There, on a narrow strip of land linking three continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe, lay Canaan, a fertile territory, but deeply marked by idolatry and war. It was a land of green hills, wide and fertile valleys, vineyards that stretched to the hills, and fortified cities that stood like bastions of power. But Canaan was not just a geographical area of abundance, it was also a strategic corridor, an obligatory transit point for caravans and armies traveling between Mesopotamia and Egypt. For this reason, it has been desired and fought over by kingdoms and empires since ancient times. Every inch of its land was coveted, its trade routes offered wealth, its fields promised sustenance, and its geographical position ensured political and military dominance. However, along with its material prosperity, Canaan was rife with perverse religious practices, where people erected altars to strange gods, performed blood rituals, and established cults that openly challenged the sanctity of Israel's God. It was, in every sense, a land of contrasts, beauty and corruption, abundance and violence, promise and threat. And in the midst of that scenario, God called his people to take possession, not only as an act of territorial conquest, but as a spiritual battle, where faithfulness to the Lord would be the true key to victory. The Bible tells us about its first inhabitants in Genesis chapter 10, verses 15 to 18. And Canaan begot Zidon his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgashite, and the Hivite, and the Archite, and the Sinite, and the Arvadite, and the Zemarite, and the Hamathite. And afterward, the families of the Canaanites were scattered. These names were not simple genealogies or mere tribal records. Each one represented nations with their own identities, developed cultures, and significant influence in biblical history. The Jebusites dominated Jerusalem, a strategic and coveted city, whose heart was considered almost impregnable until David conquered it centuries later. The Amorites, known for their ferocity and warrior spirit, spread across the mountains, exercising control over the routes and high passes, which gave them military superiority and territorial dominance. The Hittites, linked to the great Northern Empire, had deep roots in Anatolia, and their influence extended as far as Canaan, being renowned for their organization and political power. The Philistines, descendants of the so-called Sea Peoples, settled along the coast in fortified cities such as Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron, becoming one of Israel's most recurrent enemies throughout its history. Each of these peoples not only occupied lands, but also erected pagan altars, invoked strange gods, and formed powerful armies. Their presence did not simply represent a military challenge, but a constant spiritual threat, as their idolatry sought to infiltrate the midst of God's people. Therefore, the names mentioned in Scripture are not literary embellishments, but reminders of the giants that Israel had to face, not only with human weapons, but with fidelity to the true God. Archaeology has allowed us to better understand what that land was like. Tablets containing Canaanite religious texts were found during excavations at Ugarit. There appear divinities such as Baal, Astarte, and Moloch, who were worshipped with sacrifices, even of children. Archaeologist William Foxwell Albright claimed that the Canaanite religion was one of the most immoral and cruel of all antiquity. And the Bible confirms it in Leviticus chapter 18, verses 24 to 25. Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, For in all these ways the nations I cast out before you have corrupted themselves, and the land was defiled, and I visited its iniquity upon it, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. Thus we understand that Canaan was not only a fertile field of cultivation, but also a spiritual battlefield. It was precisely in this context that God called Abram from Ur of the Chaldees. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 2, he said, "Go from your country, from your kindred, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and will bless you and make your name great, and you will be a blessing." That land that I will show you was none other than Canaan. And here something extraordinary happens. While the Canaanite peoples saw it as a geographical space for their false gods, God saw it as the setting for his eternal covenant. The covenant was confirmed in Genesis chapter 15, verse 18. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates." Note that actual geographical boundaries are mentioned. God wasn't speaking of a symbol, but of a specific territory. This promise was repeated to Isaac in Genesis chapter 26, verse 3, and to Jacob in Genesis chapter 28, verse 13. The rabbis, like Rashi in the Middle Ages, explained that the entire world belongs to God, and that he has the right to give this land to whomever he wants. And he gave it to Abraham and his descendants. But Canaan was also a corridor of empires. Incense caravans from Arabia, Egyptian armies marching north, and Mesopotamian kings advancing south passed through it. The Amarna letters found in Egypt and dated to the 14th century before Christ show Canaanite rulers writing to the pharaoh to ask for help against invaders. It is a historical testimony that Canaan was always a place of dispute centuries before Israel conquered it. So the question is inevitable. Why did God choose this very small, disputed land as the center of his plan? In human eyes, it would have been more logical to choose an isolated desert or a protected island. But God chose the most coveted place to show that his purpose would prevail over the nations. Canaan then became a land of tension. On the one hand, the corruption and idolatry of its people. On the other, God's promise to Abraham. A land that, as Ezekiel chapter 20 verse 6 says, was the most beautiful of all lands. Now, after 400 years of slavery in Egypt and 40 years of wandering in the desert, the people of Israel finally found themselves at the gates of Canaan. It was the time appointed by God to fulfill the promise made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The book of Joshua tells how the people crossed the Jordan River on dry ground, a miracle reminiscent of the crossing of the Red Sea. There, 12 stones were set up as a memorial. Joshua chapter 4, verses 21 to 22 explains, "In the future, when your children ask their parents, 'What is the meaning of these stones?' you shall make it known to your children, 'Israel crossed this Jordan on dry ground.'" Bam! This act marked the beginning of a new era. Israel entered the land that God had promised, but not without a struggle. The first city they faced was Jericho, one of the oldest in the world, famous for its imposing walls. Excavations carried out by Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s uncovered remains of collapsed walls and ash layers dating to the late Bronze Age. Although she interpreted the finds as pre-Joshua, archaeologist Bryant George Wood reanalyzed the pottery and concluded that the destruction occurred around 1400 BC, the same period as the biblical chronology. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 5, Chapter 1, also recounted the supernatural fall of Jericho, claiming that it was a divine rather than human act. After Jericho, Israel faced Ai, a much smaller city, but was defeated on the first attempt. The problem wasn't military, but spiritual. Achan had taken forbidden objects from Jericho. Joshua chapter 7, verse 12 explains, "Therefore the children of Israel will not be able to stand before their enemies, but will turn their backs before their enemies, because they have become accursed." Theologian John James Davis, in his work Conquest and Crisis, notes that this episode teaches that the land could not be inherited without obedience. The covenant demanded holiness rather than military power. Thus, an eternal principle became clear. Without holiness, there is no victory. The impact of these victories was so great that several Canaanite kings joined coalitions. Israel fought against southern and northern kingdoms. One of the most important cities was Hazor, described in Joshua as the head of all those kingdoms. Excavations led by Yigael Yadin at Hazor found levels of massive destruction, with traces of fire dating to the time of the conquest. Yadin concluded that this collapse coincides with the biblical narrative. Archaeology, therefore, records not only legends, but also concrete traces of a real conquest. After years of campaigning, Joshua divided the land among the 12 tribes. Joshua chapter 21 verse 43 summarizes this moment. So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their fathers, and they possessed it and lived in it. Each tribe received its portion: Judah in the south, Ephraim and Manasseh in the center, Dan on the coast, Naphtali and Asher in the north. The geography of Israel was shaped by the divine promise. Commentator Richard Hess emphasizes that this verse is key. It marks the fulfillment of the covenant, where God's faithfulness is confirmed in history itself. The conquest was not simply a political change. It was an act of judgment against the Canaanites and a testimony to God's sovereignty. Psalm 24 verse 1 declares, "The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who dwell in it." Theologian Merrill Frederick Unger summarized, Israel's entry into Canaan was at the same time the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham and the execution of divine judgment on a corrupt culture. Thus, it was established that the land did not belong to Israel by human power, but because God was pleased to give it to them. Now, after Joshua's conquest, the land was divided, but not all the cities remained under full Israeli control. One of them was Jerusalem, which remained under Jebusite rule until the time of King David. The conquest is recounted in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 6 through 7. Then the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites who lived in that land, and they spoke to David, saying, "You shall not enter here, for even the blind and the lame will drive you out." Meaning David cannot enter here, but David took the stronghold of Zion, which is the city of David. With this act, Jerusalem ceased to be an enemy fortress and became the capital of Israel, known as the City of David. The historian Flavius Josephus, in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 7, Chapter 3, confirms that David chose Jerusalem not only for its strategic position in the mountains, but because it was at a neutral point between the northern and southern tribes, unifying them under a single kingdom. One of the most momentous moments was the transfer of the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. This event transformed the city into the spiritual center of Israel. Theologian Walter Brueggemann comments that with this act, David secured the centrality of Jerusalem not only as a political capital, but as religious capital, where God's presence was established among his people. The reign of Solomon, son of David, marked the period of greatest splendor for Israel. Under his rule, the Temple of Jerusalem was built, described in detail in 1 Kings chapters 6 and 7. The temple was no ordinary building, it was the architectural manifestation of the covenant. Solomon prayed at its dedication in 1 Kings chapter 8 verse 27. "But will God truly dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven of heavens cannot contain you, how much less this house that I have built?" Archaeology has confirmed the existence of a powerful kingdom in the time of David and Solomon. Excavations at the city of David in Jerusalem, led by archaeologist Eilat Mazar, have uncovered monumental structures that she believes may correspond to David's royal palace, supporting the biblical account of a strong and organized monarchy. British historian Kenneth Kitchen, in his work On the Reliability of the Old Testament, points out that the description of Solomon's administration is consistent with contemporary Near Eastern kingdom models, demonstrating the historicity of the account. The Psalms celebrated Jerusalem as God's chosen place. Psalm 48 verse 2 says, "Beautiful province, the joy of the whole earth, is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great king." For the Israelites, the land was no longer just Canaan, nor a collection of tribal territories. Jerusalem became the symbol of the covenant, the heart of God's people. The church father Eusebius of Caesarea called Jerusalem the navel of the world, because from there the divine presence radiated to all nations. Now, after Solomon's death, the kingdom was divided into two: Israel in the north, with its capital in Samaria, and Judah in the south, with its capital in Jerusalem. The north, composed of 10 tribes, fell first. Its history was marked by idolatrous kings and altars dedicated to Baal. Finally, in 722 before Christ, the Assyrian Empire, under King Shalmaneser V and then Sargon II, destroyed Samaria. In 2 Kings, chapter 17, verse 6, it records, "In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away captive to Assyria, and settled them in Halah, in Habor by the river Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes." The Assyrians had a policy of mass deportations. They mixed peoples, and thus the Samaritan population emerged, a mixture of Israelites and foreigners. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 9, chapter 14, confirms this Assyrian practice of forced displacement. Judah held out longer thanks to kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, who promoted spiritual reforms. However, sins accumulated. The prophet Jeremiah cried out in the streets of Jerusalem, "For my people have committed 2 evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewn out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water." Finally, the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II attacked Jerusalem. After several sieges, in 586 before Christ, Solomon's temple was destroyed and the city razed to the ground. In 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 9, it relates, "And he burned the house of the Lord, and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, and he destroyed every great house with fire." This event was one of the most painful moments in Jewish history. The Babylonian historian Berosus, quoted by Josephus in Against Apion, Book 1, chapter 19, confirms Nebuchadnezzar's campaign and the exile of the Jews to Babylon. The prophets did not interpret the exile as a political failure, but as a divine discipline. Theologian Walter Brueggemann states that exile was the most profound experience of loss and uprooting, but also the place where Israel discovered that its God was not tied to a territory. The so-called Al-Yahudu tablets, 6th century before Christ, have been found in Babylon, which mention colonies of Jewish exiles living near the Euphrates River. These tablets, studied by the Assyriologist Lawrence Stager, confirm that the Jewish community maintained its identity even in exile. Remnants of Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Jerusalem have also been found in modern excavations at the city of David. Layers of ash, Babylonian arrowheads, and remains of collapsed buildings dating back to exactly 586 before Christ. Theologian Christopher Wright, in his work The Mission of God, notes that the exile showed that the land is a gift, not a right, and it can be taken away if the people profane it with idolatry. Thus, the history of the exile teaches us that the land of Israel was not simply a geopolitical asset, but a sacred space that demanded obedience and holiness. Now, after 70 years of captivity in Babylon, God opened the way for the return of his people. The prophet Jeremiah had foretold it, and its fulfillment came when Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, conquered Babylon in 539 before Christ. Shortly afterward, he issued a decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. The historian Flavius Josephus, in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 11, chapter 1, confirms that Cyrus read the prophecies of Isaiah that mentioned his name in Isaiah chapter 45, verse 1, and moved by this, allowed the return of the Jews. The exiles rebuilt the altar, resumed sacrifices, and later built the Second Temple, completed in 516 before Christ. Although more modest than Solomon's, it remained the center of the Jewish faith for centuries. In the 4th century before Christ, Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire. His arrival brought with it Hellenization, a cultural wave that affected the entire region. After his death, the land of Israel came under the rule of his generals, first the Ptolemies of Egypt and then the Seleucids of Syria. It was under the Seleucids that the crisis described in the books of Maccabees erupted. King Antiochus IV Epiphanes desecrated the temple, sacrificing a pig on the altar and dedicating it to Zeus. This sparked the Maccabean rebellion in 167 before Christ and the subsequent cleansing of the temple, an event commemorated to this day in the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. The historian Eusebius of Caesarea, in his chronicle, recounts how Jewish resistance preserved their identity in the face of Hellenistic pressure. In 63 before Christ, the Roman general Pompey conquered Jerusalem. From then on, Judea became a client kingdom of Rome. Herod the Great was named King of the Jews by the Roman Senate in 37 before Christ and reigned with an iron fist, although he also beautified Jerusalem, expanding the Second Temple, which became one of the architectural wonders of antiquity. It was in this context that Jesus Christ was born. Matthew chapter 2 verse 1 clearly states this. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. Here we see an important detail. In Jesus' time, the land was called Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. The term Palestine had not yet been officially applied. The Roman historian Tacitus, in his Histories, Book 5, mentions Judea as a conflictive region under the rule of Rome, populated by a rebellious people jealous of their religion. The Temple of Jerusalem was the heart of the Jewish faith at the time of Christ. In the Wars of the Jews, Book 5, Chapter 5, Flavius Josephus describes the magnificence of the Herodian work, with white marble walls that shone in the sun and doors covered in gold. There Jesus preached, taught, and confronted the religious leaders. There he announced their destruction in Matthew chapter 24, verse 2. Do you see all this? Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left upon another that will not be thrown down. This prophecy was fulfilled in the year 70 after Christ, when the Romans under Titus destroyed Jerusalem and razed the temple. For the apostles and early Christians, the land remained the promised land, never Palestine. The term had yet to be established, but Israel's identity remained alive. Theologian Nicholas Thomas Wright observes that in Jesus' time, the earth was seen as the place where God was to bring his kingdom. Every step Jesus took in Galilee or Jerusalem was laden with eschatological significance. In the year 70 after Christ, Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed by Titus, a Roman general, fulfilling Jesus' prophecy, as we mentioned. But Jewish identity was not annihilated. Decades later, in 132 after Christ, the Bar Kokhba Revolt broke out, the last major Jewish rebellion against Rome. It was led by Simon Bar Kokhba, whose name means son of the star, alluding to Numbers chapter 24, verse 17. Many rabbis, including the renowned Akiva, proclaimed him as the Messiah who would restore the kingdom of Israel. The uprising arose in response to the policies of Emperor Hadrian, who banned Jewish practices, founded the city of Aelia Capitolina on the ruins of Jerusalem, and erected a temple in honor of Jupiter on the hill where the temple of the Lord had once stood. These measures, seen as humiliation and a religious offense, sparked rebellion. For 3 years, the Jews managed to recover part of the territory and establish an independent administration. However, Rome responded with all its might. Hadrian sent General Julius Severus at the head of a massive army. Finally, in 135 after Christ, the revolt was brutally suppressed. According to the Roman historian Cassius Dio, Roman History, Book 69, more than 500,000 Jews died in the conflict. Entire villages were destroyed, and Jerusalem was completely closed to Jews. The defeat at Bar Kokhba not only crushed the last attempt at political independence, but also inaugurated a long period of diaspora, which would mark Israel's history for nearly 2,000 years. Now this is where I want you to pay close attention. After crushing the Bar Kokhba Revolt, Emperor Hadrian took radical measures against the Jewish people. He banned circumcision, razed what remained of Jerusalem, and in its place built the Roman city of Aelia Capitolina, dedicated to his family, Aelius, and the god Jupiter Capitolinus. But the most significant event was the change of name of the province. Judea ceased to exist and was renamed Syria Palaestina. This term, derived from Philistia, means land of the Philistines, Israel's ancient enemies. The historian Eusebius of Caesarea claims that the purpose was to erase all Jewish memory from the region and to link it to the historical adversaries of God's people as an act of humiliation. Theologian Merrill Frederick Unger sums it up this way: "The name Palestine was a Roman propaganda tool, a deliberate attempt to eliminate the connection between the land and the people of Israel." And as modern historians Seth Schwartz and Werner Eck point out, this was not a simple administrative change, but a calculated punishment, a conscious effort to de-Judaize the land and rewrite its identity. In this way, Rome attempted to bury Israel under a new name, as if by doing so it could break the eternal covenant that God had made with his people. From this moment on, the term Palestine began to circulate in official documents, maps, and Roman chronicles. It was not a neutral designation, but rather an imposition laden with political intent. Historian Karen Armstrong, in her book Jerusalem, One City, Three Religions, explains, "The renowned province of Syria Palestine was an invention of Rome to deny Jewish identity, turning Israel into a people without a land." Archaeologist Herschel Shanks, founder of Biblical Archaeology Review, also emphasizes that the term Palestine does not correspond to the biblical designation of the land, but is a later title, born of Roman enmity toward the Jews. Now, this name change had enormous repercussions. First, the Jewish diaspora intensified. Survivors were expelled, sold into slavery, or scattered throughout the empire. Second, Jerusalem was closed to Jews. They were only allowed to enter one day a year to weep in the ruins, which later gave rise to the famous Wailing Wall. Third, the land's biblical identity was obscured by the new name. For centuries, the world would know the territory as Palestine, oblivious to the fact that it had previously been Canaan, Israel, and Judea. The church father Tertullian, writing in the 2nd century, referred to the region as Palestine, reflecting how the Roman-imposed name had become established in later tradition. Now, after the division of the Roman Empire, Palestine came under Byzantine rule. For the Byzantines, Jerusalem was the holy city of Christianity. In 313, with the Edict of Milan, Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity and soon afterward promoted the construction of churches in the Holy Land. The most important was the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre, inaugurated in 335 after Christ, on the site believed to be the empty tomb of Christ. Eusebius of Caesarea, bishop and chronicler of the time, describes in his work Life of Constantine how the emperor ordered a pagan temple to be demolished and a Christian sanctuary to be built in its place. The name Palestine continued to be used in official Byzantine documents. Chroniclers referred to it as Palestina Prima, Judea and Samaria, Palestina Secunda, Galilee, and Palestina Tertia, the Negev. In 638, Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab conquered Jerusalem. Islamic rule transformed the region. On the Temple Mount, where Solomon's sanctuary and Herod's temple once stood, two of Islam's most iconic buildings were built. First, the Dome of the Rock, in 691 after Christ, erected by Caliph Abd al-Malik, on the site where Islamic tradition claims that Muhammad ascended to heaven. Second, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which made Jerusalem the third holy city of Islam after Mecca and Medina. The name Palestine remained under the control of the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates, reflecting continuity with the term imposed by Rome. The Arab historian al-Muqaddasi, born in Jerusalem in the 10th century, wrote in his work Ahsan al-Taqasim, "The land of Palestine is the most glorious of all lands, the center of the world and the place of the prophets." In the 11th century, the Christian Crusades transformed the region into a site of bloody wars. In 1199, European crusaders captured Jerusalem and founded the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. For them, Palestine was the Holy Land, the place where Christ had lived and where faith was to be recovered. The crusading chronicler William of Tyre describes the battles and the devotion of the pilgrims in his History of the Events Beyond the Sea. However, it also records brutality. In the conquest of Jerusalem, thousands of Muslims and Jews were massacred. Crusader rule was short-lived. In 1187, Saladin, a Kurdish Muslim leader, reconquered Jerusalem after the Battle of Hattin. From then on, the region was once again in Islamic hands, although it was still coveted by Christian powers. During this period, Palestine was already more than a territory. It had become a global spiritual symbol. For Jews, it was the land of promise, although they lived in the diaspora. For Christians, it was the land of Jesus, the site of pilgrimages and crusades. For Muslims, it was a sacred place from which Muhammad ascended to heaven. Theologian Philip Jenkins, in The Lost History of Christianity, states that Palestine became the epicenter of competition between universal religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all claiming it as their own. In 1517, Sultan Selim I of the Ottoman Empire conquered Jerusalem, and Palestine became part of one of the world's greatest powers. For 4 centuries, the region was under Turkish administration. The Ottomans divided Palestine into districts, sanjaks, and governed it from Damascus and Istanbul. The land was primarily used for agriculture, but over time it fell into neglect and poverty. Several Western travelers described the region as in ruins. American writer Mark Twain, in his book The Innocents Abroad, 1869, wrote after visiting the region, "Palestine sits dressed in sackcloth and ashes. Desolation reigns throughout the land. There is hardly a tree or a bush." His testimony reflects the deterioration of the land under centuries of foreign rule. However, the Jews never forgot their connection to Jerusalem. Small communities remained in cities such as Hebron, Safed, Tiberias, and Jerusalem. Rabbi Judah Alkali, 19th century, preached that the return of the Jews to Zion was a prophetic obligation. These ideas would be precursors to the modern Zionist movement. In the 19th century, European powers began to take an interest in Palestine, especially for strategic and religious reasons. Christian pilgrims visited it, archaeologists searched for biblical remains, and diplomats saw it as the key to controlling the Middle East. During World War I, the Ottoman Empire allied with Germany, which brought it into conflict with the British. In 1917, General Edmund Allenby's troops entered Jerusalem, ending 4 centuries of Ottoman rule. That same year, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, in which Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour declared Britain's support for the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. The text read, "Her Majesty's government welcomes the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best efforts to facilitate the achievement of this objective." This document was historic, as for the first time a world power recognized the right of the Jewish people to return to their ancestral homeland. Historian Benny Morris, a specialist in the Arab-Israeli conflict, describes it as the diplomatic starting point of the modern state of Israel. After the war, the League of Nations granted Great Britain the mandate for Palestine, which was formalized in 1922. Under this administration, thousands of Jews began emigrating from Europe, especially fleeing pogroms in Russia, and later, Nazism in Germany. The Zionist movement, led by figures like Theodor Herzl, considered the father of Zionism, promoted the purchase of land and the creation of agricultural settlements. The slogan was clear: a land without a people for a people without a land. But the reality was complex. Palestine was also home to Arab, Muslim, and Christian communities that opposed Jewish growth. This led to increasingly violent clashes. In 1936, the Great Arab Revolt erupted, in which Muslim Palestinians rebelled against the British and Jews. The conflict escalated into World War II. During the Holocaust between 1941 and 1945, 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazi regime. This tragedy gave strength to the call for a Jewish state. Thousands of concentration camp survivors sought to emigrate to Palestine, increasing pressure on Britain. The journalist and politician Winston Churchill had said years earlier, "There is no more indisputable connection in history than the connection of the Jews with Palestine." After the Holocaust, this truth became even more evident. Now, faced with the growing violence between Arabs and Jews, Great Britain decided to hand the problem over to the newly created United Nations. In 1947, the UN proposed a partition plan to divide Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state, with Jerusalem as the international city. The Jews accepted the plan. The Arabs rejected it. On May 14, 1948, in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion officially proclaimed the independence of the State of Israel, fulfilling the dream of generations of Jews to return to the Promised Land. The ceremony took place just hours before the end of the British Mandate. The independence document declared, "By natural and historical right, and by virtue of the resolution of the United Nations, we proclaim the establishment of the Jewish state in the land of Israel, which shall be known as the State of Israel." That same day, the United States and the Soviet Union immediately recognized the new state. But the following day, 5 Arab countries, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq, declared war on Israel. The newly formed Israel faced much larger and more heavily armed armies. However, it managed to resist and expand its territory beyond the UN partition plan. Historian Benny Morris describes in his book 1948 that this war defined the fate of the region. Israel survived, but hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled, giving rise to the plight of the Palestinian refugees. The conflict left a wound open that remains alive to this day. After the war, Jerusalem was divided. West Jerusalem under Israeli control. East Jerusalem, including the Old City and the Temple Mount, under Jordanian control. The Jews were barred from their holy sites, including the Western Wall. For them, the promise of Psalm 137 verse 5 remained alive. "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill." In June 1967, Israel faced Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in the so-called Six-Day War. In a stunning military triumph, Israel conquered East Jerusalem, including the Western Wall, the West Bank, ancient biblical Samaria and Judea, Gaza, Sinai, and the Golan Heights. Historian Michael Oren, in 6 Days of War, argues that this war transformed the map of the Middle East and gave the Jewish people back control over Jerusalem for the first time in 2,000 years. For many Christians, this event was seen as a prophetic fulfillment of Zechariah chapter 8, verses 7 and 8. "Thus says the Lord of hosts, Behold, I will save my people from the east country, and from the land of the going down of the sun, and I will bring them, and they shall dwell in the midst of Jerusalem, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God in truth and in righteousness." After 1967, the conflict intensified. Palestinians began organizing under the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, founded in 1964 and later led by Yasser Arafat. Its initial goal was the elimination of Israel and the creation of a Palestinian state throughout the region. In 1987, the First Intifada, a popular Palestinian uprising against the Israeli occupation, broke out. Later, in 1993, the Oslo Accords brought hope, mutually recognizing the State of Israel and the Palestinian Authority. However, peace was never consolidated. Journalist and historian Bernard Lewis summed up the conflict this way: "Nowhere else in the modern world do two peoples so fervently claim the same territory for historical, religious, and national reasons." Today, the term Palestine is used to refer to the territories of the West Bank and Gaza, partially administered by the Palestinian Authority and partially controlled by Israel. But its origin remains the same, a name imposed by Rome to erase Israel, which over time was adopted by Arabs, Muslims, Christians, and finally by modern politics. Theologian Charles Ryrie states that, although men call the land Palestine, in Scripture it remains Israel, because God's gifts and calling are irrevocable. From Genesis to Revelation, the land is not a secondary detail, but the linchpin of the divine covenant. God told Abraham in Genesis chapter 17, verse 8, "And I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land in which you are dwelling, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." The word perpetual indicates that, even if empires change names, Canaan, Judea, Syria Palestine, the Holy Land Palestine, in the eyes of God it will always be the land of Israel. Theologian Charles Ryrie explains, "The Abrahamic covenant is unconditional and eternal. Although Israel was dispersed, God's right to the land was never revoked. The prophets announced that the people would return to their land after the dispersion. Ezekiel chapter 36 verse 24 states, "And I will take you from the nations, and gather you from all lands, and bring you to your own country." This return, which we saw fulfilled in the 20th century with the establishment of the State of Israel, shows that God continues to work in history. Jewish scholar Eliezer Schweid stated that the modern return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel is not a historical accident, but part of the prophetic memory that was never forgotten. The Bible also warns that Jerusalem will be the center of conflict in the last days. Zechariah chapter 12 verse 2 says, "Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling to all the surrounding peoples against Judah in the siege of Jerusalem." And in verse 3 he adds, "On that day I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all peoples. All who burden themselves with it will be broken in pieces, though all the nations of the earth will gather against it." Today we see how Palestine and Israel continue to be the focus of international conflict, fulfilling the prophetic word. Historian and theologian Arnold Fruchtenbaum comments that no other place in the world attracts as much political and spiritual attention as Jerusalem. This in itself demonstrates that biblical prophecy is alive. In Christian eschatology, Palestine, that is, the land of Israel, will be the final stage of the glorious return of Jesus Christ. Revelation 16 speaks of Armageddon, a battle in the land of Israel. Matthew 24:30 announces that they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Zechariah 14 verse 4 states that on that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is opposite Jerusalem. Theologian John Walvoord, an expert on prophecy, wrote, "The land called Palestine in history is the scene of the future eschatological fulfillment. Christ will reign in Jerusalem, and from there he will rule the nations." Many see the conflict between Israel and Palestine as a simple political issue, but in light of the Bible it is much more. It is the manifestation of a spiritual war over the land God promised. The Apostle Paul reminded us in Romans 11 verse 29, "For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable." That is, the covenant with Abraham has not expired, and what the world calls Palestine remains in the eyes of God, the land of Israel. The history of Palestine is not just the story of a name, nor of a disputed land. It is the story of how God revealed his plan in a specific place, and how nations have attempted to erase what he decreed. Palestine, Israel, Canaan, different names, one eternal purpose, a small land that remains at the heart of God's plan for humanity. Today, Palestine and Israel are at the center of the longest-running conflict in modern history. The term Palestine refers to the West Bank and Gaza, while Israel claims the land as its biblical and national heritage. Two peoples, one land, one endless dispute. The most sensitive issue remains Jerusalem. Israel declares it its eternal capital, while the Palestinians claim it as the capital of their future state. This fulfills the prophecy of Zechariah 12 verse 3. "In that day, I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all peoples. All who burden themselves with it will be broken in pieces." The United Nations has passed more resolutions on Israel than on any other country, confirming that Jerusalem is the center of the world. Rabbi Shlomo Riskin stated, "Jerusalem is non-negotiable. It is the place God chose for his eternal dwelling." Theologian John Walvoord explained, "The Arab-Israeli conflict is a living fulfillment of prophecy." The Bible announces that this land, politically called Palestine, will be the scene of Christ's glorious return. And so we come to the end of this video. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for staying until the end and being part of this moment of truth and reflection. If this message spoke to your life, I invite you to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs it. Because every click, every time you share, you're helping the word reach further and touch more hearts. We'll meet again in the next video with a new message from heaven for your soul. Until then, may God's grace and peace accompany you every day. May God bless you abundantly.